Morgan Freeman calls 911 after a whisper from a 5-year-old girl at McDonald's. We dream of reaching 1,000 subscribers by the end of February. Subscribe to the channel and be part of this dream too. Morgan Freeman had always appreciated the simple joys of life. Despite his fame, he found comfort in routine, in quiet moments where he could simply exist as an ordinary man. That evening, he had stopped by a McDonald's on the outskirts of Atlanta, hoping for nothing more than a warm coffee and a moment of peace. The hum of conversations, the scent of crispy fries, and the occasional giggles of children filled the space. He had just taken his first sip when he noticed a small figure standing near the counter. A little girl, no older than 5, her tiny hands gripping the fabric of her faded dress. There was something unusual about her stillness, the way her wide brown eyes darted around, searching for something or someone. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, her frail frame barely noticeable in the bustling fast food restaurant. People moved past her without a second glance, too preoccupied with their own lives to notice the silent plea in her expression. Morgan's heart clenched. There was something familiar in the way she held herself, a kind of quiet resilience that he had seen in many young children who had endured more than they should. As if sensing his gaze, the girl lifted her eyes to meet his. Her lips trembled, and she took a hesitant step forward. Then, in the softest voice, one that barely carried over the noise of the restaurant, she whispered, "Help me." The simplicity of those 2 words sent a shiver down his spine. It was not the typical, playful request of a child seeking attention. No, this was something deeper, urgent, raw, filled with a fear too profound for someone so young. Morgan leaned forward, lowering himself to her level. "What's wrong, sweetheart?" he asked gently. The girl glanced over her shoulder before whispering again, this time so softly that he had to strain to hear. Her little hands fidgeted, twisting the hem of her dress as she cast anxious glances toward a man sitting alone in a corner booth. Morgan followed her gaze and immediately felt a sense of unease. The man was stiff, his fingers drumming against the table, his gaze flickering between the girl and the exit as if waiting for the perfect moment to act. Something was undeniably wrong. Morgan's pulse quickened. He had played many roles in his life, embodying men of wisdom and power. But this was real. This was a child in distress, and he could feel it in his bones. He reached for his phone, his fingers hovering over the screen. The little girl bit her lip, her eyes silently begging him to act. Whatever was happening, she had chosen him to intervene. And so, without hesitation, Morgan Freeman pressed 911. Morgan Freeman held the phone to his ear, his deep voice steady but urgent as he relayed the situation to the 911 operator. He kept his eyes on the little girl, who now clutched his sleeve as if he were the only anchor in a world that had long stopped feeling safe. Her tiny fingers trembled against the fabric of his jacket, and he could feel the weight of her fear. The operator's voice was calm but serious, asking for details. Her name, a description of the man, any immediate danger. But when Morgan knelt to ask the girl her name, she hesitated. Her lips parted, but no sound came. It was as if fear had stolen her voice entirely. Behind them, the restaurant remained blissfully unaware of the storm brewing in that small corner. Parents laughed over their meals, teenagers scrolled through their phones, and employees bustled behind the counter. But Morgan was hyper-aware of the man in the corner booth. He was growing restless. His fingers drummed faster. He had noticed Morgan speaking to the girl. Their eyes met for the briefest moment, and Morgan saw something dark there, an edge of anger, of possession, a silent warning. Then, in an instant, the man stood up, grabbed his drink, and turned toward the exit. He was leaving. Morgan's instincts kicked in. If that man got away now, there was no telling what would happen next. He could disappear into the night, taking with him whatever horrors had led this little girl to whisper for help. Without thinking, Morgan shifted his position to block the girl from view, keeping a protective hand on her shoulder. "He's leaving," Morgan murmured into the phone. "Wearing a gray hoodie, jeans. Average height, maybe mid-40s. Caucasian. Dark hair, some stubble. Something's not right." The operator assured him that officers were en route, But that didn't ease the knot in his stomach. How long would they take? How many minutes before the little girl's only hope faded into the night? The girl tugged at his sleeve again, urgency in her wide, tear-filled eyes. "Don't let him go," she whispered. Her voice was hoarse now, like she had been screaming before this moment, before she had realized no one else was listening. Morgan didn't hesitate. He wasn't a police officer, but he was a man who had spent a lifetime understanding human nature. He knew when danger was real. Just as the man reached the exit, Morgan stepped forward. "Hey," he called out, his voice carrying its natural authority. The man hesitated, glancing back. For a moment, time seemed to suspend, the sounds of the restaurant muffled by the tension thickening the air. Then, the man bolted. Morgan didn't think. He ran. His body may have been older, but adrenaline was a powerful force, and so was the need to protect this child. The door swung open as he pushed forward, following the fleeing figure into the dimly lit parking lot. The streetlights flickered above, casting long shadows as the man darted between cars. Somewhere in the distance, sirens wailed, growing louder. Morgan's breath was heavy, his heart pounding, but he wasn't going to let this man vanish. Not when a terrified little girl had trusted him to stop it. Morgan Freeman had never been a man to hesitate when someone needed help. Tonight was no different. As the man in the gray hoodie bolted through the McDonald's parking lot, Morgan surged forward, determination igniting his every step. The cool night air burned against his face as he ran, his heartbeat thundering in his ears. The man weaved between parked cars, knocking over a stray shopping cart in his frantic attempt to disappear into the shadows. Morgan wasn't an athlete, but his sheer will kept him moving, his feet pounding against the pavement, closing the distance between them. The wail of approaching sirens gave him hope. Help was coming, but he couldn't let the man slip away before they arrived. He focused on the details, his gait, the frantic way he looked over his shoulder, the shape of his build under the baggy hoodie. Every detail mattered. The man turned a sharp corner toward an alley behind the restaurant, desperation oozing from his every movement. Morgan followed, his instincts screaming that whatever this man was running from, it wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was fear, the kind that only came from being caught in something vile. Just as Morgan rounded the corner, the man lunged, shoving a stack of metal trash bins into his path. The crash was deafening. Morgan barely managed to dodge the worst of it, stumbling but staying upright. His breath was ragged now, but his resolve was stronger. "Stop," he called, his voice carrying the same authority that had commanded the attention of audiences for decades. The man hesitated for just a second, just long enough for Morgan to see the flash of something in his eyes. Guilt, terror, recognition. Then, like a caged animal seeing its final escape, the man took off again. But this time he didn't make it far. The red and blue lights of a police cruiser bathed the alleyway, illuminating the man's panicked face. Tires screeched as two squad cars skidded to a halt, blocking the alley's only exit. Officers jumped out, guns drawn. "Hands up! Get on the ground!" one of them barked. The man skidded to a stop, his body tensed, his breath coming in sharp gasps. He raised his hands, his fingers twitching as if debating whether to make a final, desperate move. Morgan slowed, chest heaving as he approached the officers. One of them, a tall, broad-shouldered cop with sharp blue eyes, turned to him. "Mr. Freeman?" he asked, momentarily caught off guard by the unlikely hero in their midst. Morgan nodded, still catching his breath. He was trying to leave after the girl asked for help, Morgan explained, motioning back toward the McDonald's. The officer's expression darkened, and he gestured for his partner to cuff the man. The suspect didn't resist. He simply lowered his head as the cold metal locked around his wrists, his shoulders sagging as if he knew his fate had just been sealed. Back inside the McDonald's, the little girl stood by the counter, still gripping the fabric of her dress. Her eyes flickered between Morgan and the officers, her tiny chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Morgan approached her slowly, kneeling to meet her gaze. "He's not going to hurt you anymore," he murmured, his voice as warm and steady as ever. The little girl blinked, processing his words, then did something that shattered the last of Morgan's restraint. She threw her arms around his neck and sobbed. Her small body trembled against him, and Morgan wrapped his arms around her, shielding her from the world that had already taken too much from her. He didn't know her story yet, but he knew one thing with certainty. Whatever darkness she had endured, it ended tonight. The little girl's sobs trembled against Morgan Freeman's chest, her small arms clinging to him as though he were the only safe place in the world. He could feel her fragile frame shake with the weight of emotions too big for her young heart to bear. Morgan held her gently, letting her cry, his hand moving in slow, soothing circles on her back. Around them, the McDonald's had quieted. Conversations had dimmed, and people now stared, whispering in hushed voices, their curiosity mingled with confusion. But Morgan didn't care. All that mattered was the girl. A female officer knelt beside them, her blue uniform crisp and professional, but her expression was soft with concern. "Sweetheart," she said gently, "can you tell us your name?" The little girl sniffled, her fingers twisting into the fabric of Morgan's jacket. She hesitated, her lips pressing into a thin line. Fear flickered in her deep brown eyes, as if saying her name might summon something terrible. Morgan leaned back just enough to look into her face. "It's okay," he said, his voice low, calming. "No one is going to hurt you now." For a moment, the girl simply stared at him, studying his face as if searching for a truth that had been missing all her life. Finally, in a voice so quiet it was nearly lost beneath the hum of the restaurant, she whispered, "Lena." The officer nodded, making a note, her features kind but watchful. "That's a beautiful name, Lena. Can you tell me who that man was?" The little girl flinched, her tiny fingers clenched tighter into Morgan's coat, and she shook her head violently. Tears welled up in her eyes again, but this time, she fought them back. "I don't know," she mumbled. He said I had to go with him, but I don't want to." Morgan's stomach tightened. He exchanged a look with the officer, whose jaw set in a grim line. A man taking a child who didn't know him. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was something much worse. The officer glanced toward her partner, who was securing the suspect in the back of the squad car outside. "We need to call Child Protective Services," she murmured, "and see if there are any reports of missing children that match her description." Lena's breath hitched, her eyes darting up in panic. "No," she pleaded, clutching Morgan's sleeve with renewed desperation. "Please don't make me go. I just want to stay with you." The words struck Morgan like a blow to the heart. He swallowed hard, his throat tight. There was no logical reason for this child to trust him so deeply, but she did, and that trust was sacred. He couldn't walk away. The officer sighed, sympathy softening her features. "We're not going to take you anywhere unsafe, Lena," she assured her. "But we need to figure out where you came from. We need to find out who's looking for you." Morgan looked down at the little girl who had clung to him in a world where she had no one else. He wasn't her father. He wasn't even a man she had known more than an hour. But in this moment, she had chosen him, and he wasn't about to let her down. He turned back to the officer, his voice steady, his decision made. "I'll stay with her," he said firmly, "until we figure this out. I'm not leaving her side." The hum of the McDonald's felt distant now, as if the world had faded into the background, leaving only Morgan Freeman and the frightened little girl who clung to his sleeve. Lena's tiny fingers gripped the fabric with such desperation that it sent a pang through his chest. She didn't just need protection. She needed someone to stand by her, to assure her that this wasn't just another passing moment of safety before everything went dark again. The female officer, whose name tag read Officer Reynolds, glanced at her partner, who was still speaking to dispatch near the squad car. The suspect sat in the back seat, his face shadowed and unreadable. "All right, Mr. Freeman," she said, folding her arms. "You say you're willing to stay with her while we sort this out?" Her tone wasn't challenging, but there was hesitation there, as if she were trying to decide whether this was an emotional impulse or a genuine commitment. Morgan looked down at Lena, who had buried her face against his side, trembling as though every nerve in her small body was on edge. He didn't have all the answers, but he knew one thing with certainty. He wasn't going to let her feel alone. "I mean it," he said, his voice carrying the same weight that had captivated audiences for decades. "This child is afraid, and until we know where she belongs, I'm not leaving her side." Reynolds studied him for a long moment before nodding. Okay, she relented, her voice softening. We'll take her to the station for now, just until we have more information. But Mr. Freeman, if she's missing, this could be bigger than we think. Lena's small fingers tightened around his sleeve at the word station. She didn't say anything, but Morgan could feel the way her body tensed, how her breath hitched ever so slightly. She didn't want to go. She didn't trust the police, or at least, she didn't trust that they wouldn't send her somewhere worse than where she had been. Morgan knelt beside her, looking into those wide, frightened eyes. Lena, listen to me, he said gently. We're just going to answer some questions, okay? No one is going to take you anywhere without us figuring out what's best for you first. He hesitated before adding something even more important. You're not alone anymore. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, with a tiny nod, she whispered, okay. Reynolds sighed, rubbing the back of her neck as she spoke in her radio. We're bringing in a possible missing child. No name in any current reports yet, but we'll check databases once we're back. Morgan felt the gravity of that statement settle in his chest. No reports. That meant no one had come looking for her. No frantic parents. No Amber Alerts. No missing child flyers. Nothing. A cold realization settled over him. What if no one had ever been looking for her at all? The ride to the police station was quiet, save for the occasional crackle of the radio and the distant hum of city life outside. Morgan Freeman sat in the back seat of the cruiser, his arm gently wrapped around Lena, who curled into his side as if trying to disappear. Every now and then, she would steal a glance at the flashing lights outside, her expression wary, cautious. She had agreed to come, but her body remained tense, as if she expected the moment of safety to be ripped away at any second. Officer Reynolds drove with steady precision, while her partner, Officer Miller, sat in the passenger seat, typing notes into the onboard system. Still no matches, Miller muttered after a few minutes. I ran her description through the missing persons database. No recent reports for a girl her age. He glanced back in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. That's not normal. A child this young? Someone should be looking for her. Morgan felt Lena press closer to him, her tiny fingers gripping the sleeve of his coat. He exhaled slowly. That means either she was never reported missing, or someone made sure she wouldn't be found. The words tasted bitter in his mouth. Reynolds glanced at Miller before shifting her gaze to Morgan. That man from McDonald's, he had to have some connection to her. He ran the moment she asked for help. She paused. And yet, she said she didn't know him. Morgan looked down at Lena. Is that true, sweetheart? He asked softly. Did you really not know him? Lena hesitated. Her small hands curled into fists, and she bit her lower lip. For a moment, it seemed like she might not answer. Then, in the faintest voice, she whispered, I think. I was supposed to. Morgan's heart tightened. Reynolds met his gaze in the mirror. Supposed to, she echoed. What do you mean by that, Lena? The little girl shifted uncomfortably, her breath quickening. He said I belong to him now. She shuddered. But I don't. I don't. A sharp silence filled the car. Morgan's fingers tightened slightly around her hand, grounding her. Lena, where were you before McDonald's? He asked, his voice calm but firm. Do you remember? Her face scrunched as if fighting through a haze. Then she nodded. A house. But not my house. She hesitated, her brows knitting together. There were other kids. Morgan exchanged a look with Reynolds. A chill ran through him. Miller's typing stopped abruptly. He turned, his face grave. Other kids? He repeated. Lena nodded. We had to be quiet. Always quiet. And we weren't supposed to leave. But I ran. Her voice wavered. I ran and hid. And then I found McDonald's. Morgan inhaled sharply. The weight of her words settled deep in his chest. She hadn't just been lost. She had escaped. Reynolds' jaw tightened. We need to find out where she came from, she murmured. If there are other children. Morgan looked down at Lena, whose small fingers still clutched his sleeve. She had risked everything to run, to find someone who would listen. And now, whether he had planned for it or not, her story was in his hands. And he wasn't going to let her down. The police station was a stark contrast to the warmth of McDonald's. Sterile, quiet, lined with desks where officers sifted through reports and answered calls. Lena's tiny hand remained firmly wrapped around Morgan's as they stepped inside. Her small body was tense, her feet hesitant against the polished tile floor. Morgan could feel her heartbeat quicken through the grip of her fingers. She had come this far, but deep down, she was still afraid that safety was an illusion. Officer Reynolds led them past the main floor and into a quieter office. The walls were lined with maps, missing person flyers, and bulletin boards covered in pinned reports. Lena's eyes flickered over them, scanning the photos of strangers, lost faces, stories that had been left unfinished. Morgan knelt beside her, his deep voice low and steady. "You're safe here, sweetheart," he assured her. "No one is going to take you back there." She nodded, but her little fingers still trembled in his grasp. Reynolds and Miller exchanged a look before Miller sat at the desk, pulling up files on his computer. "All right," he said, exhaling. "Let's start from the beginning. Lena, can you tell us anything else about where you were?" Lena's lips pressed together. It was clear she wanted to answer, but something held her back. Morgan gave her hand a reassuring squeeze. "Take your time," he said gently. She swallowed, then whispered. It was a big house. Old. The walls were dirty. Her small voice wavered. There were other kids. I don't know how many. Some were bigger than me. Some smaller. Reynolds leaned forward. "Do you remember any names?" Lena hesitated, then nodded slowly. "Sammy," she said. She had curly hair. "And a boy named Kevin. He was really quiet. He never talked." Morgan's stomach twisted. "Other children. More than one." Miller's fingers flew across the keyboard, searching for any reports of missing children named Sammy or Kevin, but nothing came up. The longer he searched, the deeper the silence became. "Still nothing," he muttered. No reports matching her description. No matches for other missing kids either. Reynolds exhaled sharply. "How does a house full of children go unnoticed?" she murmured. "Someone should have reported this. Someone should be looking for them." Morgan glanced at Lena. Watching the way she fidgeted with the hem of her dress, the way her little shoulders slumped under the weight of what she knew. Then he realized she didn't expect anyone to come looking. Lena bit her lip, hesitating before adding, "The man, the one at McDonald's, he said it was my turn." Morgan's chest tightened. "Your turn for what, sweetheart?" She took a deep breath, her small hands curling into fists. Then, in a voice so fragile it nearly broke him, she whispered, "To leave with someone." Reynolds sucked in a breath. Miller's fingers froze over the keyboard. Morgan felt cold all over. This wasn't just an abandoned house. It was something much worse. The weight of Lena's words settled over the room like a thick fog. Morgan Freeman clenched his fists, his heartbeat a steady drum against his ribs. To leave with someone. The implications were chilling. This wasn't just a neglected house. It wasn't just a place where children had been abandoned. It was something much worse, a place where they were being taken. Reynolds was the first to break the silence, her voice taut with restrained emotion. "Lena," she said carefully, "when you say it was your turn to leave, did you mean someone else left before you?" Lena's little fingers twisted into the fabric of her dress. Her lower lip trembled as she nodded. "Sammy," she whispered. 2 days ago. She was crying. She didn't want to go. Morgan felt his pulse spike. "Go where?" Lena swallowed hard. "I don't know," she admitted, voice barely above a breath. But she never came back. Reynolds and Miller exchanged a look, and Morgan could see the same realization forming in their eyes. This was beyond just a missing child. This was a pattern, a system. Children being taken one by one, disappearing into the night, never to return. Miller cursed under his breath and turned back to his screen, typing furiously. "I'm running another search, widening the range. If there's even a single missing child that matches Lena's description, I'll find it." His voice was sharp, controlled, but there was an urgency beneath it that hadn't been there before. Reynolds crouched beside Lena, keeping her voice gentle. "Sweetheart, do you remember anything about the people who came for the others? Did you ever see them?" Lena shook her head. "We weren't allowed to look," she murmured. "We had to stay in our rooms. But I heard them." She shuddered. One of them had a deep voice. Like yours," she said, glancing at Morgan. "Not nice like yours, though." It was scary. Morgan inhaled sharply, his mind racing. Someone had intentionally kept these children hidden. someone powerful enough to make them disappear without a trace. And yet, against all odds, Lena had escaped. She had broken the cycle. The room was thick with tension as Miller suddenly let out a sharp breath. Got something? His fingers flew over the keyboard, pulling up a report. 4 months ago, a 5-year-old girl named Samantha Collins disappeared from a foster home in Georgia. He turned the screen toward them. She was last seen with an unidentified man outside a gas station. Reynolds's expression darkened, and no one connected this to anything. No leads, no suspects. Just another missing kid lost in the system, Miller said grimly. He scrolled further. But here's the part that's going to make your stomach turn. This is the 3rd case like this in the last year. All young children, all taken with no clear evidence of how or why. Morgan's breath came slow and steady, but inside, something fierce was building. Lena had run. She had survived. And now, she was the only thread leading back to something much darker than any of them had anticipated. He looked down at her, this fragile child who had carried a burden no child should ever bear. She was the key. And Morgan Freeman, a man who had spent his life telling stories, now found himself in the center of one that had to be stopped. "We need to find that house," he said, his voice firm. "And we need to do it fast." The air inside the police station had shifted. What had started as an unusual incident, a famous actor stepping in to protect a lost girl, had transformed into something much darker. Morgan Freeman sat beside Lena, his arm protectively around her small shoulders, while Officers Reynolds and Miller combed through files, piecing together a puzzle that had remained unseen for far too long. Miller's fingers flew over the keyboard. "I expanded the search radius based on Lena's description. Abandoned properties, foreclosures, off-the-record rentals. Anything that could be a house where kids were kept out of sight." He exhaled sharply, his jaw tightening. "There are 3 potential matches within a 20-mile radius." Reynolds leaned over his shoulder. "Which one fits best?" Miller pulled up satellite images, his face grim. "This one," he said, enlarging an image of a dilapidated house on the outskirts of town. Vacant for 5 years. Owner listed as deceased. No rental history. And he clicked another file, pulling up a record. A noise complaint was filed 3 months ago. Neighbors reported hearing crying. But when authorities arrived, they found nothing. Morgan's stomach twisted. Nothing. Because the children were being hidden. Lena tugged at his sleeve. Her wide eyes darted to the screen, studying the grainy image. Her small fingers gripped his hand. "That's it," she whispered. Reynolds' breath hitched. "You're sure, sweetheart?" Lena nodded quickly. "The tree in the front. It has the broken swing." That was all the confirmation they needed. Miller grabbed the radio from his belt. "Dispatch, this is Officer Miller. We need immediate backup. Possible child trafficking case. Send all available units." His voice was clipped, urgent. Morgan inhaled deeply, his grip tightening on Lena's small hand. The truth was finally coming to light, but the fight wasn't over. If there were other children inside that house, they were running out of time. The raid begins. The convoy of police cruisers sped through the darkened streets, sirens cutting through the silence of the night. Morgan sat in the back seat of Reynolds' car, Lena tucked beside him. She hadn't said much after identifying the house. Fear weighed heavily in her small frame, but there was also something else, determination. She had escaped, and now she was leading others to freedom. As they neared the location, the energy in the car changed. The house loomed ahead, just as haunting as it had looked in the satellite images. It was a relic of forgotten time. Peeling paint, boarded-up windows, a collapsed porch. But it was the stillness that sent a chill down Morgan's spine. Something was wrong. The officers took their positions. Reynolds turned to Morgan. "Stay with Lena," she ordered, her expression firm. But Morgan was already shaking his head. "No," he said evenly. "I need to see this through." Reynolds hesitated for only a second before nodding. Then, with weapons drawn, the officers moved in. A battering ram smashed through the front door, the sound echoing like a thunderclap in the night. "Atlanta PD," an officer shouted. "Come out with your hands up." Silence. Then a noise. A scuffle. Footsteps pounding against the wooden floors. Miller and another officer stormed inside. There's movement upstairs. Morgan's pulse pounded. Lena clutched his sleeve, her breath shallow. They're trying to hide, she whispered. Then a scream, small, frightened, distant. Reynolds bolted toward the staircase. "We've got kids in here," she called back. Morgan didn't wait. Ignoring the shouts behind him, he pushed forward, following Reynolds up the rickety stairs. His lungs burned, but adrenaline propelled him forward. At the end of the narrow hallway, a door stood slightly ajar. Inside, the room was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of dust and something far worse, fear. Huddled against the far wall were 4 children. A boy with hollow cheeks, a girl clutching a tattered stuffed animal, a toddler barely old enough to walk, and Sammy. Lena gasped, breaking free from Morgan's grip. "Sammy!" The older girl looked up, eyes wide in disbelief. And then she ran, straight into Lena's arms. Morgan felt his chest tighten as he watched them cling to each other. Sammy was here. She was alive, but they weren't safe yet. Footsteps thundered from below. "We have suspects escaping through the back," an officer shouted. Reynolds turned to Morgan. "Stay with the kids." Then she was gone, racing toward the chaos. Morgan knelt before the frightened children, his voice steady despite the storm raging around them. "It's okay," he assured them. "You're safe now." But even as he said it, a dark thought settled in his mind. Whoever was behind this, they weren't done yet. Morgan Freeman knelt among the trembling children, his deep, reassuring voice the only anchor in the storm of chaos unfolding around them. Sirens wailed outside. Shouts echoed through the decrepit house. But in this room, time stood still. Sammy and Lena clung to each other, their small bodies shaking with silent sobs. The other children, pale, frightened, huddled close, their wide eyes darting toward the door as if expecting something worse to come. From downstairs, Officer Reynolds' voice rang out. "We've got runners. They're trying to escape through the woods." Morgan's pulse quickened. Whoever had been running this operation, they weren't going down without a fight. His instincts screamed at him to stay put, to shield the children, but something gnawed at his gut. What if they weren't just running? What if they were coming back to silence the only witnesses who could destroy them? Then a creak. Morgan's breath hitched. The door to the room had been left slightly ajar, but now it was moving. Slowly, quietly. Someone was still inside the house. His hand instinctively went to the closest child, guiding them behind him. He rose to his full height, his imposing presence filling the room. The door inched open another fraction, and then a shadow moved. Before Morgan could react, a figure lunged from the hallway. A man, tall, broad shoulders, cold, dead eyes. His face was masked, but his intent was unmistakable. He wasn't here to escape. He was here to make sure no one else did. Morgan barely had time to shove the children back before the man swung. Something hard, a metal pipe, cut through the air. Morgan ducked, the force of the swing grazing past his shoulder, sending a shock of pain up his arm. He stumbled but didn't fall. He couldn't fall. The children screamed. Sammy clutched Lena, shielding her tiny body as best she could. Morgan straightened, his breath steady despite the burning pain. He had played fighters, warriors, men of strength. But this wasn't a role. This was real. And these kids, they needed him to win. The man charged again, pipe raised high. This time Morgan was ready. He stepped to the side at the last second, catching the man off guard. Using the momentum against him, Morgan slammed his elbow into the attacker's ribs, knocking him off balance. The man grunted, staggering back, but he wasn't done. His hand moved to his waist. A knife! Morgan's eyes narrowed. This was life or death. Then a gunshot. The masked man froze. His knife clattered to the floor. A deep, guttural groan escaped his lips as he crumpled, clutching his leg where a bullet had ripped through. Morgan turned to see Officer Reynolds standing at the doorway, gun drawn, chest heaving. "Drop it," she commanded, even though the man was already down. Miller rushed in behind her, securing the attacker in cuffs. "We got the others," he reported, breathless. 4 suspects. But this guy, he nudged the bleeding man with his boot. He was the one giving orders. Reynolds yanked the mask off. Morgan's breath hitched. It was the man from McDonald's. The one who had tried to take Lena. The one who had almost gotten away. Reynolds grabbed him by the collar. "Who do you work for?" she demanded. The man chuckled darkly, despite the pain. His lips curled into a sickening smirk. "You think this stops with me?" he rasped. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." Morgan clenched his fists. "Then enlighten us?" The man only smiled, blood staining his teeth. "You'll find out soon enough." The threat lingered in the air, chilling despite the warmth of victory. The children were safe. The suspects were in custody. But Morgan knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. His station was eerily quiet despite the night's chaos. The children had been given blankets, their tiny bodies wrapped in warmth as they sat in a secure room under the care of social workers. Morgan Freeman stood just outside, his hands resting on the glass window, watching as Lena and Sammy clung to each other, whispering softly. They had survived, but survival was only the first step. Behind him, Officers Reynolds and Miller were deep in conversation, sifting through files, linking missing children to what they had uncovered in that house. The reality of it all settled like a heavy weight in Morgan's chest. How many more children had been lost before Lena escaped? How many were still missing? Miller exhaled sharply, rubbing a hand over his face. "This is bigger than we thought," he muttered. "We trace financial transactions from the suspects' accounts. There are deposits from offshore sources, anonymous accounts feeding money into what looks like an organized network." Reynolds frowned. "So, they weren't just taking children. They were selling them?" Morgan's stomach twisted. He had suspected it, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more horrifying. "And the buyers?" he asked, his voice low, dangerous. Miller shook his head. "That's the problem. These people don't operate like small-time criminals. They use encrypted communications, fake identities. Whoever is funding this operation has the kind of power that makes them untouchable." Morgan's fists clenched. Untouchable. It was a word he had heard too many times in stories of injustice. But this wasn't a story. This was real, and he wasn't about to let it be buried. Reynolds turned toward the interrogation room. "He hasn't said much," she admitted, nodding toward the man from McDonald's. The one who had tried to take Lena, the one who had led them to the house. He sat in the cold room, wrists cuffed to the table, his expression unreadable. "He's smart. Knows we don't have enough to reach the people at the top." Morgan studied the man through the glass. Smug, arrogant, untouched by the weight of his crimes. That infuriating smirk still lingered on his lips, as if he knew something they didn't. Morgan straightened. "Let me talk to him." Reynolds hesitated. "You sure?" Morgan's gaze didn't waver. "He thinks he's untouchable." He turned to face her. "But he wasn't expecting me." Reynolds exchanged a glance with Miller before nodding. "All right," she said, opening the door. "Let's see if you can break him." The interrogation. Morgan stepped into the room with the kind of presence that had silenced theaters and commanded respect for decades. He didn't need a badge or a gun to have power in this room. He was power. The man barely looked up as Morgan sat across from him, his smirk deepening. "Didn't think I'd end my night talking to a movie star," he drawled. "You a cop now, Freeman?" Morgan clasped his hands on the table, his deep voice steady, unwavering. "No," he said, "but I am the man who made sure you didn't take that little girl. And I'm the reason your operation is falling apart." The smirk twitched. Just for a second, a crack. Morgan leaned in, lowering his voice. "You see, men like you think you're invisible. You think you can hide in the shadows, that no one will notice the lies you destroy. But you made a mistake." He tilted his head. "You picked the wrong child. And now, the whole world is going to know what you've done." The man's fingers twitched against the cuffs. Morgan caught it. Fear. He pressed forward. "Tell me, do you think your employers will protect you now? Do you think they'll come for you? Or do you think they'll erase you before you can say a word?" A flicker of uncertainty crossed the man's face. Morgan leaned back, giving him space to let the thought sink in. Because he was right. Whoever these people were, they had no loyalty. They wouldn't risk exposure for a single pawn. The silence stretched. Then, the smirk disappeared. The man swallowed, shifting in his chair. "If I talk," he muttered, voice barely above a whisper, You make sure I don't end up dead in a cell." Morgan's jaw tightened. "You tell us everything, and I'll make sure you live to regret it." A long pause. Then he nodded. Morgan exhaled slowly. They had him, and with that, the truth was finally coming to light. The morning sun painted the horizon with hues of deep gold, but inside the police station, the weight of the night still lingered. Morgan Freeman sat in the conference room, his hands folded, listening as Officer Reynolds and Miller pieced together the final pieces of the case. The man from McDonald's, Michael Grant, had finally broken. His confession had cracked open something much larger than any of them had imagined. This wasn't just a local operation, Miller said, pacing the room. The house was just one of many. They were moving kids state to state, using abandoned properties as holding stations before selling them off. He stopped, his expression grim. And they've been doing it for years. Morgan's chest tightened. How many children had disappeared into the darkness before Lena escaped? Reynolds set down a thick folder on the table. Grant gave us locations, names, enough to launch a full-scale investigation. Her voice was steady, but her knuckles were white where they pressed against the file. Federal agents are already moving in on several targets. We're talking coordinated raids in multiple states. She looked up, her eyes locked on Morgan. You were right. This wasn't just a crime. This was a system. Morgan exhaled slowly, and Lena had been the key to breaking it. In the next room, through the glass partition, Lena and Sammy sat together, huddled under warm blankets. The other rescued children were being processed, but those two had clung to each other all night. They had survived, but their battle wasn't over. They had lost everything. Morgan turned back to Reynolds. What happens to them now? Reynolds sighed. They'll go into protective custody for now. Foster care if no relatives come forward. She hesitated. They're safe, but they'll need time to heal. Morgan looked at Lena through the glass, at the way her small hands gripped Sammy's as if she were afraid to let go. She had trusted him. She had chosen him, and now he couldn't just walk away. He pushed his chair back, his decision already made. I want to help. Miller raised a brow. Help how? Morgan met his gaze. I have resources, he said simply. Connections. If these kids need a future, I'll make sure they get one. His voice was steady, resolute. No more forgotten children. Reynolds studied him for a long moment before nodding. I'll make some calls. Morgan took one last look at Lena. She had been lost, discarded like she didn't matter. But now, because of her courage, she had been found. And as long as he had breath in his body, he would make sure she was never lost again. Weeks later, the world knew the truth. The story had made headlines across the country. Morgan Freeman saves abducted child, exposes trafficking network. But to him, it wasn't about the headlines. It was about Lena, Sammy, and the other children who had been given a second chance. Standing outside the courthouse, he watched as federal agents led away high-ranking criminals in handcuffs. The system that had thrived in the shadows was finally crumbling. And Lena? She was safe. Finally safe. Morgan had done many things in his life. But this was the most important story he had ever told. And it wasn't over yet, because there were still more children out there, waiting to be found. And he would never stop looking. If you made it this far, comment where you're watching from, and let us know if the story of justice moved you.